the Creoles in my family lived around what is now Preservation Hall, but there were several other societies that were part of the whole network that they had of lodges and societies that they used for not only social societies to meet, exchange ideas, do business deals, but also for entertainment, keeping the community active. And these musicians obviously played at these venues. Mm-hmm. What many people don't know about is that Congo Square, which everybody is sort of familiar with about New Orleans, it's located by the cathedral there. For many years, starting in the early 1800s, was an area that was available on Sundays for all the slaves to come and have a day of recreation. So that recreation always included music and dance. And so my free relatives who lived around Congo Square were influenced by the African music that they saw, people that used and made homemade instruments because slaves were not able to buy instruments. So while they were getting their classical training and learning how to play classical instruments, they were also seeing native African and made-up African rhythms using homemade sometimes instruments. And so they were definitely influenced by that. My relatives who were involved with jazz also, for example, felt the kind of brunt of the lead up to the Civil War. So as we were leading up to the Civil War, there were a couple of things happening in New Orleans. So the Creole societies were happening, and that was a place where Creoles could get together. They could meet sort of outside of Southern scrutiny and talk about things that were happening. A lot of times they were agitating for their civil rights as they saw their civil rights being taken away. And so what was happening in New Orleans was that after it became a state, there was and really before it became a state, there was the largest slave revolt in American history in New Orleans. And it just so happens that this slave revolt, started about 30 miles outside of New Orleans and started to move towards New Orleans, picking up slaves as it came. It stopped about a mile or two from the plantation where my relatives lived. So black and white relatives, right? The three Azor brothers that I talk about in the book, they all had a free woman of color that they were involved with. They had a number of children that were on the plantation. And luckily, they weren't, victims of the revolt. Mm-hmm. Pretty bloody revolt. And so after that, white people, the planters, were really fearful of what they saw happening with the number of blacks and how they were sort of in a state of constant revolt. They weren't accepting slavery well. Mm. And New Orleans happened to have a problem with the added problem of not only having these French and Spanish slaves coming from Africa, free people of color, Choctaw Indians, Natchez Indians. They had this wild kind of mix of people. After it became a state, Germans, Italians, Scottish started to come into the city. So it was a pretty, I don't want to say unruly crowd, but a pretty diverse city. Some of the newcomers were not used to seeing a free black community that was prosperous and really in control in some ways of the city of New Orleans. So they started to ratchet up legislation against them. They started to make it so that you couldn't free a slave over 30 years old. Now, up until this time, people moved in and out of slavery pretty easily during the French and Spanish times. They had liberal manumission laws. But the Americans decided, no, we're going to ratchet this up. They wanted to control how many people came into New Orleans. There were so many free people of color and so many slaves that they had problems distinguishing between the two. So they said, okay, now every free person of color has to register at the mayor's office when they come into the city. and we have to know your whereabouts, and you have to be able to prove your freedom at any time. That hadn't been something that my early relatives had to do. So the folks on my side of the family that were musicians, the Tios and the Pavajos, some of them formed a colony and went to Mexico.